And we're live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Sacha Basho, who's the Regional Vice President of Sales in North America West for NetFoundry. And a good friend of mine, I've known Sacha for quite some time now, and I'm very, very excited to have her on the show today. It's going to be phenomenal, so stick around. Welcome, Sacha. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Welcome or hello from the West Coast. So we're a few hours behind you. We're still catching up this morning.
So the first time when we spoke and I've seen your background, like my first reaction was like, is this a real background or is this just a one of those murals that people use?
I'm sorry, for my bio?
No, your background, like your actual background.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, no, this is my actual office. So back a few years ago, I started working more remote and I wanted it to be happy. So I live in Oregon, which is known for its beautiful greenie, and that comes with rain. So to keep me in a happy place, I have this lovely cantaloupe office, which keeps my spirits high.
Yeah, that's awesome. You know, people do create these spaces that they enjoy because it's, we spend so much time in the office and it's a part of the day to day. And I think it makes a big difference to have things that we like. So why don't we get started and maybe like just give us a quick background of how you started. What was your first role like? You know, what kind of led you on to kind of pursue a career in cybersecurity because it wasn't your first choice to begin with. And then we go from there.
Yeah. So, I think my technology story is similar to a lot of people's even. So I started out in communications, as you mentioned, not security. And that happened by chance, like most people, right? First job out of college, worked for AT&T. And then that just progressed over time as I moved into leadership. And really where the jump for me in security occurred is I was lucky to work with a third-party RiskSense as a partner for the telecom company. And I started to recognize, just like I'm old enough to have seen the shift from a telecom department to IT, to recognize that there's also a shift going from IT to security. So it'll be interesting as we see the money shift, the decision-making shift. So I recognized about 10 years ago I needed to start understanding more about security. And luckily for me, an opportunity opened up at RiskSense where they needed someone to run their channel group. And specifically, two of their largest partners were telecommunication companies. And that's where you and I met, right? Where we were trying to sell security within a traditional telecom or carrier space. And it was very, very interesting. For me, I think that the part that was, I always tell people, look, you get into these roles, and someone was willing to take a chance on me because of my relationships and the ability to translate business terms from technology, because that's really always been kind of my forte. I don't focus too much on just the technology. I focus on what are we going to solve for. And that's really critical as we become more and more partner dependent. If you're on the product or manufacturing side, we are dependent on partners to make introductions. And so to keep what they're looking for to qualify opportunities simple and synthesized and be able to get them to communicate your message, it's not easy. So I was afforded that opportunity the first year. I didn't know what they were talking about half the time. So luckily I had a very patient organization and I did know how to navigate the partner ecosystem through relationships. But I mean, most of the time I had, get offline and say, what was that person talking about?
Yeah, but you're very modest though, because I've seen you maybe like after that year and I've seen you present and you were very technical. You dove down into some very deep details, or at least I don't know if you were faking it or you were just, but you held your own. Especially for the technical team there. Of course, we dove a little deeper and somebody else came along, but you've done a phenomenal job coming into not from industry and managed within that year to really catch on. So do you feel that you have a certain aptitude for technology? That's something that you wanted to pursue to begin with?
I am super curious about solving problems. So what was interesting for me, right, is in like all sales, it's about solving somebody's problem. So for me, from a technical perspective, I probably rate myself differently than you. But to your point, I certainly can work with the terminology and understand quickly where somebody sits in a stack. But at the end of the day, I'm moving towards what's the problem we're really solving for the client. And that's really my big driver. I find it really fascinating when you see someone take your product or solution and apply it to their environment and the gains that they receive through that. So that's really, I would say, where my interest comes from. And I'm pretty adaptable. I've been in sales my whole career, right? So you can't be in sales if you're not adaptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And things change so quickly, right? The way we sold technology back, 5, 10 years ago, even in the past, year and a half, with COVID, everything done remotely, things really change. And I think we don't focus enough on the business aspect of problem solving. I feel a lot of times we come in and we talk about the platform, what it does, and so on. And really, the person, behind the desk, or in this particular case, in the Zoom meeting, um, they all they want to do is they want to solve a problem, and it's typically from like the top 10 problems they want to solve. Maybe they have one critical one that this is why they're going to go out and spend the money. So, what was your process of discovery typically when you come in? This is the first time you talk to a client. Um, how would you find what that is or what that hot button is? Because they typically don't like to share it first thing first.
Well, I think any of us have been doing this for a long time. You're going to ask some questions that they're not going to sound remedial. So, right out of the gate, I don't ever get into a presentation without just asking a few baseline questions to make sure that we use the client's time correctly. At the end of the day, everybody's time is getting more and more valuable. We have less and less of it. So, it's really important, I think, to show some interest in using the time that you have with them effectively. And I've never had anyone balk at sharing their initiatives, right? So if you talk to them about, what are your team's initiatives? What are your company's initiatives? What are the priorities around how you're going to fund those types of things? People will share that high level information. And oftentimes they'll share more. My basic rule is always, hey, you have two ears and one mouth. I certainly didn't create that. But if you're spending more time talking than listening, oftentimes that's not going to be a great call. So, and if somebody took your call, usually for a reason, so they're willing to meet with you because they think you're in that area of what they might be looking for. So the faster you can get to tying into what's important to them, the faster you get through the process, and the time that you spend is used well for everybody all around.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk a bit about sales as a whole. So, but people don't realize how many times a day they sell. Whether to their team members or their boss or their colleagues or even their reports or whatever else. We always are selling no matter what. And in the role, for example, being a channel leader, you're selling to the partners, then you're selling to the customers, then you're selling back to management. And to be able to kind of align the selling or the goals of the end results is to generate revenue for the company with a different I guess needs and wants for each side is quite tricky. So what was it like to be running channels for a startup company in the cybersecurity space? What was it like?
Well, to your point, I think it's equally, you spend equal time with the partner that you do with your own leadership. I think when you're in a startup environment, sales are never fast enough. Oftentimes you have somebody who's very heavy on the technology side. And when you create something, you're going to have a natural perspective on that, where your technology is the best and why. The challenge is if you can't package that in a way that someone can understand or comprehend, they'll move on. And with partners specifically, there's other things like what's in it for them. Can you increase whatever initiative they have going on? Do you fill a gap in your portfolio? Do you communicate that in a way? And I think in a startup environment, because people are wearing so many hats and it's usually very technology driven versus sales driven, it's difficult. You spend as much time really on the outside as you do on the inside, helping educate your own organization, as well as educating the partners on why they should be talking to you. I think one of the most effective things that I'm not sure that most of my leadership ever understood is if we have a partner, right, understanding how they're compensated, understanding how you tie into that with them for them to get their field sellers, paying attention. I mean, at the end of the day, they're trying to hit metrics. So if you can enable that in a different way that has less friction for them, pays them more. So it's really important to understand from that perspective, the partner ecosystem. And I would say that I am semi-successful in trying to get my own internal leadership to understand that. Like I said, usually most startups are heavy tech focused. So they're very excited about the nuts and the bolts, right? And just to some degree, you're entering into a space that they're not necessarily familiar with, and they don't understand, why isn't everybody buying us?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting you brought up. So asking the question, which is kind of almost a funny question to ask, like, how do you get paid?
Yeah.
How do you get paid? Asking the channel, and the reason you have to ask it, if you can, you mentioned if you can align, how they get paid or help them get paid more, because they are very much coin operated because they have a choice. They have hundreds of products most times, and they can pick the ones that are easiest to sell, right? So, and then you mentioned the tech focused startups that are, they go out there and focus on the tech as opposed to focus on on the business issues, and then also they get married to an idea that their way is the best way, and then the market doesn't care. People don't really care about the underlying innovation per se. They care about solving the issue. So a lot of that time, that's where I think the kind of the economy is between building a great product that is technologically superior, and also aligning that with what the market needs. I think that's a big
Well,
problem to solve.
ease of use, right? Ease of implementing is something that really needs to be taken into consideration. And, as we move in this hybrid cloud environment, a lot of legacy enterprises still have on-premise solutions. You still need access to private data centers and those types of site to site, right, versus being in a public cloud. And this hybrid scenario makes it oftentimes really difficult for a startup because most of them are cloud first. They may have a software deployment depending on how long they've been around that can be installed on an appliance on prem, but most of the time you find yourself in a cloud environment, and then you get to deal with all the legacy IT and security policy and process issues. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things for them to adjust to, because when you're mid market, right, you've already been built kind of in this cloud first environment where a lot of applications sit there. And when you're enterprise, you're dealing with inheriting oftentimes 10, 20, 30 years of legacy decisions and infrastructure that you will have to navigate to get your product and solution deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. And people don't necessarily, enterprise don't necessarily want to install yet another, you know, gadget, or have another, GUI or interface to watch and so on. So that's another challenge. And how would you overcome, since you work in a startup environment, how would you overcome the question of, like, who are you? Are you going to be here tomorrow? Because it's something that I think a lot of these companies encounter all the time.
Yes.
Um, so tell me about a bit about that challenge.
So we've had the advantage of coming out of an incubation lab. So we are actually incubated out of the Todd Innovation Group. And because of that, we've had the advantage of funding that's very different than most startup environments. We were a budgetary line item until we basically were basically moved out and became our own entity in August of 2019. So we still receive, that's our primary investor. And when you have a multi-billion-dollar organization as your primary investor, it makes a huge difference in your stability. To your point, working in the startup environment, I am now getting used to fielding that question. In the past, right, I didn't really understand the chaos that happens, I'd say, or instability that happens in software development. I came from a legacy environment, communications, really didn't understand the over promise scenario. And as I've been in it more, I understand why clients ask those questions. It's why I think proof of concepts or proof of values are really incorporated into most organizations' buy cycle at this point, because they actually want to try it before they buy it. Just knowing there's so many nuances and areas that can be challenges for software companies. So to some degree, I had an advantage because we've had really stable funding and continue to have that investment. So it's not as applicable in this current organization as it has been in the past for me.
And another topic, I think, for sales leaders specifically, is that you have to trailblaze your own path from a revenue standpoint. So the problem is that you have the executives, they're saying, okay, they're committing a certain number to the board, and now that number is now attached to your name, and they're saying, okay, Sacha, you go, you have your entire country, you go now do $5 million this year, and but there's no precedence for that. No one ever sold $5 million. No one even sold $350,000. And
Okay.
so, you're laughing because this is true. So talk to me about that. What was your reaction? How would you cope with that as a sales leader?
I think what's even more challenging is, to your point, people are trying to figure out, like, it's a developing go-to-market strategy. I call it kind of theory versus practical. So people are theorizing on where they see the opportunity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then you have to validate that with whatever data that you have, and digging in with use cases. So I think the thing that's been successful for us has been, when we find a use case, looking for as many targets, customers that fit that particular profile, and then prioritizing selling to that use case and turning those into case studies, so that whatever you're doing, you're really advancing towards that number. And the key also piece of that, there's some of these things don't change, which is pipeline build, right? Getting quickly an effective engine around lead generation, so that you can have the sellers that you brought into the scenario fed to some degree, right, where they can qualify those, figure out quickly how to prioritize those. But to your point, it's a balance. I've never seen in a startup environment something that I would call necessarily realistic. There's I would call it a BHAG most of the time, and then you're building towards that. But to your point, it's really hard when you don't have a precedent that's set or a path forward. So what we've tried to do is break that down around advances, and then communicate, right, when we find those use cases, let's narrow the focus. I think that's probably the most difficult thing, because the company constantly wants to go, but we can do all these things, right? And keeping a startup prioritized, making their decisions based upon priorities, because you're never over resourced in a startup environment, is probably one of my most difficult challenges and tasks. Um, and keeping those priorities.
Yeah, and creating a repetitive process as well, right? Because you really don't have an idea of how long the sales process takes. How long does a realistic POC or proof of value is going to last, and what are the success criteria, and all of that is something that you have to figure out, and you have to come back with some realistic expectations. Sometimes you feel like, okay, it's going to take 30 days, but it really doesn't. It takes like 6 months depending on the technology, and then by that time priorities change, and time is the killer of all transactions. um,
Yep.
so it's all stuff that you typically had to deal with on a regular basis. Now, talk to me about the what you've seen the current environment, you know, as opposed to the past environment, from a lead generation, from a kind of noise perspective. There's thousands of security vendors out there. People get inundated with LinkedIn messages, emails, all these bots. Apparently, I heard the statistics like 10 years ago it would take like between 7 to 10 touch points, but I think all those sales bots right now, it raises the bar to like you need a 30, 40 touch points because people think you're a bot. I have people from LinkedIn that think that I'm a bot, that I've been connected with them because they had no idea that I send a one line and they think it's some sort of machine sending them, sending those
Yeah.
messages.
I mean, we've never had so much data, right? And whether it's being sales emails or contacts or LinkedIn contacts, um, I think we're all struggling with, how do you filter what's real? And I think that's one of the difficult parts also of messaging. So if you don't quickly understand where your differentiators sit, which is oftentimes a challenge in a startup environment because you don't have the same level of support from a competitive intel perspective, but quickly, I think the thing that is effective is getting to a message that quickly allows you to help someone affiliate to where do you sit in the stack, and then how do you differentiate. It works for both partners and clients. But to your point, people are inundated. They use whatever the newest buzzword is around features and benefits, measurable risk. I mean, you know what they all are in security. So quickly getting to a place that you can demonstrate differentiation, summarize differentiation, right? That's where I found that we've been able to change the message up. And then to your point, helping people understand that you're a real person versus just a machine. So And I think the thing that we've had taken away from us in this environment is you used to be able to do that at events. So I think that's probably been the most difficult part of COVID for myself and our organization is about the time that we were really able to launch. We kind of headed right into the heart of COVID. And that makes it really difficult when you're in an emerging technology, trying to get people to listen to your message, understand where you're from, who you are, why they should listen to you. Doing that in person is far easier, I think, than, to your point, going through some type of written communication.
Yeah,
And
and
I haven't figured out the secret. You might want to have someone on this call to the whole contracting out lead generation. That is not something that I have found the secret to yet. And I know that some people have made it work really well. Again, so many products out there, but it might be something for you to consider on this call, because I think that is an area of specialty. And like I said, personally, I've never found the secret to that.
and I also find that people don't have the patience anymore to sit on a Zoom for an hour and a half and watch your technology do the whole dog and pony show. They're, strictly they want you to get to the point within 25, 30 minutes, and it's really tough. So, we don't sell widgets. Some of the stuff that we work on is complicated.
Right.
How do you get your message across in such a short time, and then also trying to do discovery on their side to find out what they really care about? How do you deal with that?
I feel lucky we're simple. We have a simple solution. I mean, literally, we're network as a service, we're platform based, right? We're private networking and secured remote access. So I do feel lucky because I literally can show somebody how to stand up a WAN in less than 10 minutes, using private internet and using zero trust architecture. So what I would say is we're lucky from that perspective, because our technology is not that hard for somebody to understand where we sit. Now, the differentiators is like you said, David, we have to quickly get to those, because everybody right now has heard about zero trust. It's the buzzword in our business. And so helping people understand, no, we're not basically adapting to that. We were built with that in mind, and here's why that matters to you it's a pretty quick message for us, actually. But to your point, most of the solutions out there are far more complex. It just happens to be in this case, we have the advantage. What I will tell you is I think I have a hard time even getting people to stay for 45 minutes. So what we've done is we've adapted our message to about 30 minutes for less technical audiences. For more technical audiences, really, we look at a staged approach. So you get the first window to quickly give that summary statement and hopefully get someone to show up for that amount of time. And then they're willing to invest if they hear something they're interested in. They're willing to invest another 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. And quite honestly, most of our clients go through a POV process, right, where they actually get their hands on the tool. Luckily, it doesn't take a lot for us to get people onboarded and have the ability to play with that. And that's one of the advantages of being in, I think, SaaS and in the platform. It's not very expensive for us from that perspective to deploy in a trial basis.
And do you typically like to reach out to large enterprise, mid market, SMPs? What's your kind of preference that when you think about how can I, get to my number as quickly as possible?
Yeah. So as an organization, like all startups, we want logos. And we're looking for the larger logo, the better. I think the challenge with that, which I don't have to tell you, right, is actually getting somebody in an enterprise environment to adopt a new product for a variety of reasons. Mid-market is a place I feel like it gets overlooked and undervalued for most organizations that are startups specifically. It's a great place to kind of beta, do some trial, pull out bugs, which everybody has in software, right? Figure out where your vulnerabilities are. So in the mid-market, those entities are far easier to adapt to. We'll give you quick feedback. You're not dealing with these large inventories of legacy infrastructure that you have to navigate or arduous security IT scenarios. So I personally would like to focus predominantly on mid-market, but from a company perspective, right, we clearly still are looking for those larger logos. And we've been able to attain some of those. From my perspective, they take a lot of time, a lot of investment. And depending on how hard your product is to deploy, right, it can really sink the ship. Um, Even from a cash flow perspective, right, you have to take into consideration what is their billing cycle. Once you get through the PO cycle and all that procurement stuff that happens with larger entities, I think it can be really, really tough on a startup to frame their model. I personally like a more opportunistic approach, which is you focus in the mid market, high end mid market of that, or maybe low end enterprise. Really build out your proactive prospecting in those areas, and then opportunistically you pull in enterprise organizations, either through one of your clients moving into that organization, meeting them at an event where that enterprise has a gap, they know they need to fill that gap. But that's kind of my personal theory. Is I think it's much easier on the sales team and the organization to start in that mid market. Gives you the momentum that you're looking for, and then also a diversification of your revenue streams. Because I've been in several organizations where you lose a large client, and that can be 10% of the overall revenue to a startup, and that does have a massive impact on the organization.
Yeah, I've heard startups with one client was like 80% over there, one big client, and they live and die by that. So did the COVID-19, made an impact on specifically on how you approach the marketplace? I mean, there's winners and losers. Some companies are doing, phenomenally well, depending which industries they are, and some are not so well. And so how did you adjust your approach, and what do you see now? Things have really changed, since in the past, 15 months.
Yeah, we didn't adjust too much because we were already a small sales organization trying to basically get our message out to as many people as possible. Of course, I have allergies, so excuse me. So we didn't adjust too much. But what we did have to do is really fine tune our message because people were getting inundated. So before we had the luxury of more people being interested in being educated, whether that be through a webinar or one-on-one sessions, or doing a presentation at an event. But that went away with COVID. I think everybody's schedules are triple booked. If you can't clearly articulate what value you're going to bring to that organization, the likelihood of you getting any time is almost nothing. I mean, even my own inbox, and I'm, on the sales end, I probably have 40 to 50 telemarketing or, telemessages, people trying to prospect me. That doesn't even include LinkedIn, every day. So I can't even imagine being a CIO or director, who's usually our target of security or IT. Can't even imagine being that, what those inboxes must look like. And so just getting past the filters, being succinct in your message. I think that's also another challenge when you work in a heavy technology company, because they want to get everything in one message. And so you're constantly trying to coach your own organization around no bullet points. People are probably reading it from a smartphone. So how do you adapt? How do you be succinct? And really, it's about differentiation. How do you differ, and what problem are you solving that they can relate to?
And that messaging is so tough to find out what that is, because as soon as you come out with something and it works, it looks like you have other 5 competitors adopting that, and it's almost like you're only unique the first couple of months, and then somebody else grabs the same messaging, and now it's me too.
Yep. Feels like
So
Formula One, right? Like they changed the engine, and like they have a 3-year run rate, which is probably now 2 years on success. I feel like that's very similar to business. Today, you used to have a much longer time to figure things out. And today, you have to constantly be innovating. You have to be constantly adapting your message. And I think you have to find a way to use technology to narrow the focus on your target. Broader messages, I just don't think work. So whether that be vertical based, people are looking for specialties. Do you know my business? Do you know my industry? Can you articulate a problem that is industry wide? Those are the things that seem to be getting better response. And honestly, for a startup, it's difficult to synthesize a message and then make it more specific by industry, unless you prioritize, right? Where you have a use case in manufacturing, and then what do people care about there? In a couple of bullets, how do you articulate that? And then how do you articulate your differentiation from everybody else coming at them?
yeah, absolutely. And I think you touch upon something like really critical. kind of the pace of change, the rate of change in the industry as a whole, and even in society, like with the way we deal with things and how quickly information propagates. All that has an impact on employees, clients, and companies, and so on. In from your perspective, what would you recommend, to do, and how do you deal with it on a day-to-day basis of how fast things move? Because I'm assuming that when you joined a company, things were like a certain way, and then 3 months later, things are different, and then 6 months later, again, things are different again. It's something that we have to be comfortable with. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the rate of change is it wears a lot of people out, right? So anything that an internal organization or leader can do to narrow the impact on their employees, help them, um, keep things in perspective and prioritize. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about me is I don't care to be technical. I know you said that. That's not really where my interest lies. And I make those statements a lot, right? Where I'm not the technical person, but I will solve your business problem. Part of why I like that is it allows me to focus in on what I know actually has money attached to it. And that hasn't changed that much, right? Trying to find a problem isn't that as hard, I think, as trying to separate yourself from a technology perspective. So, to your point, this pace of change is really difficult on employees. In my experience, it takes about a year for somebody to ramp, no matter what your onboarding process is. And the larger the organization, oftentimes the tougher the onboarding process is. So what I see a lot of organizations do, you had mentioned it, right? In startup environment, set huge targets, then they're disappointed. One of my companies, I asked, well, what's the closing ratio? Because the number didn't make sense to me. And they used, which this will make you chuckle, 70% assumed close rate.
Wow,
I don't know about you, but boy, that's like nirvana, right?
that is a great closure rate.
Yeah, well,
That
it was
is amazing.
right? I mean, I was like, okay,
It's,
now I'm understanding how they got to this number because it didn't make any sense to
yeah,
me.
you don't
And
get the steak knives when you get that closing
I mean,
rate.
if
You
we're
get
excited,
the
right? What is it, like
Ferrari.
20 or 25%, right? I mean, that's a good close ratio depending on what you're measuring from a pipeline perspective. So, at the end of the day, anything you can kind of do to narrow the amount of data coming at employees that is not necessarily relevant to them doing their job and doing their job effectively, I think really helps. I know personally, I've started to build my own playbook because I'm recognizing someone who my first job was almost 5 years, my second job was almost 7 years, my third job was almost 11 years. Now I'm lucky if I can stay 2 or 3 years in an organization because of outside influences. And personally, what hasn't changed is humans' ability to adapt. I don't think that, at least in the Gen X, we make the moves as fast. I think millennials and some of those other generations coming up, right, they were raised in this level of adoption. And so for me, I've had to kind of just say, okay, what are the core things I need to do to start adding value to my organization? I look at other people, and then I look to supplement that. I'm not going to be able to have the technical answers, but I have friends in my network from 30 years where I could say, hey, will you listen to this and give me your opinion? Right? Will you listen to our pitch and help me understand, right, where you think we sit? So I have relationships. So you have to get comfortable with not knowing everything. I think that oftentimes is difficult when people come from an engineering background because they like to have all the answers. And I'm not sure that you can even do that today. I think you
Yeah.
have to get comfortable with going and doing research, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and be comfortable with the change as well. I love that. I love that approach, and you're right. Things are not going to change. I think the rate of acceleration is going to increase anyway, and we might get to a point where we're all like freelancers, right? We're like the gig economy, where you're going to be wearing multiple hats as a VP of sales for 5 startups and have to juggle all 5. So, kind of my next question is, where you're successful today, Sasha. Where do you go from here? Like, what if what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
If you had like the dream job and the dream endeavor in terms of what would that be?
So, for me, it's always about people. So, I learned pretty early on in my career, I started to see what my success patterns were, and they're really all about putting myself in a role where I can help people develop, meet goals that they didn't even think they could meet themselves. And so as long as I get to interact with both end clients as well as team members, and solve puzzles. I mean, I'm really a puzzle worker, and I solve most puzzles through people. And so that's a different way of looking at things. But when it comes to, I enjoy the hiring, I enjoy the development part. So for me, it doesn't necessarily matter what the title looks like. What I am clear about is that I certainly don't have an interest in wearing every hat. I prefer staying in the areas that I know that I work very effectively in. And so that will always kind of limit my areas of interest. I don't have an interest in moving into more of a technical side of the house. I have an interest in always leading on the sales side, marketing side, customer service side, because those are all people first parts of the business. And that's the part that I inherently love. I think, I'm getting to that place where you're on the back nine and you're like, okay, what am I going to do in my retirement years? And, one of the things I would encourage people to think about is the fact that there's one of the gaps for me was I never really had anyone coaching me on the art of the possible. So I think most of us are a product of our environment. So if you don't have a family member who went to college, or you don't have somebody encouraging you to take risks, then you don't really know what's out there. And I think the one thing I try and always do when I'm talking to my friends' kids or younger people is just to encourage them to understand that your degree does not dictate, right, where you're going to end up in your career. Like most of us over time figure out what we really enjoy. So from a perspective of like what happens when I retire, I mean, I think I'll probably end up in some type of an organization that encourages youth, and gives them exposure to what you can do with an accounting degree. What can you do with an engineering degree? You're not limited. And what's interesting is I just read an article from HBR this week, Harvard Business Review, on the diversity or on software engineering. And some of the best categories of people they aren't coming out of school, right? They're basically people who like to build things, who are adaptable and curious. And so what was really refreshing, and I think Deidre, you had on one of your last calls, right, where she's building a platform that isn't requiring necessarily credentials or education, but it's more about, have you done these types of roles before? Do you have abilities, right, that will meet this role's needs? That was pretty refreshing for me, because I think as humans, we have filters, whether or not you're conscious or subconscious, but we have built-in filters. And I think we miss some of the core elements that make somebody successful in a role or not. And one of those is passion. So for me, again, it's going to be about helping people that really probably come from diverse backgrounds and encouraging them to look at things that they might have an aptitude for, but won't necessarily have exposure to. An example of that is my friend's son is an introvert, loves to game, definitely is going to work in a corporate environment, even though her and husband are very entrepreneurial in nature. And she's like, I'm not really sure how to support this. And I said, well, he's young, put him in some coding classes, right? And he should absolutely be looking at cybersecurity. We have a huge talent gap in that area. So trying to help girls not think about being a hairstylist if they're good in science and math, but understanding there's a whole roadmap, which I think that STEM has helped elevate that awareness for a lot of young ladies. That when I was growing up, I had my calculus teacher who said, Sacha, you should really think about engineering. Of course, I didn't follow his advice. And years later, I still think, you know what, that would have been an interesting path for me. I just thought I was going to be stuck in a room, right? I didn't understand that can just be a foundational understanding that takes you right to a leadership level. So I think helping the next generation for me, I shouldn't even say the next generation, I should say helping anybody that is interested in developing, understand that really they're the only ones limiting their capability, and then helping them find resources that can give them access and exposure to jobs and roles that they may never have had before or thought of, being in their reach.
Absolutely. And I think that the days of the job defining you are over. They should not be defining you. So, Sacha, this is tremendous insight as well. I wanted to just ask you, like, last question: where can people find you if they're looking for advice, or just to partner with you, or just get in touch? What's the best way?
So you can find me. LinkedIn's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And so Sacha Basho, spelled with a C, Sacha, last name Basho. It's pretty simple. But you can find me there. Certainly, I'm always open to LinkedIn. And clearly, I'm interested in helping people grow in their careers. So if I can make the time where it's not a burden on my organization, when I've got a commitment there, I'm happy to give my time to people around Insight. And one of the things we didn't talk about was recruiting. So I'm actually pretty good at that. So if you're looking to hire as a sales leader and trying to figure out that unique talent, I absolutely can. I have some opinions on that are pretty
Maybe
strong.
we'll do another quick session and we'll cover that specifically. I feel like we need to do some more. But Sacha, thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. Thanks all for joining. Looking forward to seeing you in the next session.
Sounds great. Appreciate your time, David. Thanks